Nigeria, a country in the western part of Africa and a leading political and economic power in Africa, is home for over 200 million people from 371 tribes. Nigeria has witnessed countless number of mild and upscale violent clashes among the tribes in the northern part of the country. The country predominantly adopts Christianity, Islam, and traditional beliefs as her religion. The constitution of the country allows for freedom of religion. The clashes in the northern Nigeria are multidimensional, sometimes taking the face of intertribal, intra-tribal, religious dissent, resource control, and more. Religious-wise, the Muslims dominate the north, while the Christians dominate the southern part of the country. In the south, Christians and the Muslims cohabit in families without any clash. There are interreligious marriages where the two partners continue to practice different religion without any clash with religious undertone. However, in the northern parts, which can be described as the political hotbed of the nation, it is common to see violent communal clashes that claim lives in hundreds and have rendered millions of people homeless. The critical question that boggles the mind is that why is it almost all the clashes in the northern Nigeria tagged a religious clash, especially when there is a peaceful coexistence among these religious adherents in other parts of the same country? Could there be other causes masquerading as a religious clash? To solve the incessant violent and deadly clashes, both Nigerian government and international governmental and non-governmental agencies have sponsored research into the root cause of the violent clashes. To provide solutions that will solve the problems, accurate data is non-negotiable. We must go beyond insinuations and identify the real factors and actors. In this special report, brought to you by Royal Destiny Media on causes of violent clashes in northern Nigeria, we present the findings of the research conducted by the International Crisis Group titled What Data Says About Herder Farmer Violence in Nigeria, and the findings of the Mercy Corps and USAID funded research presented by the United States Institute of Peace in a discussion tagged Religion, Identity, and Conflict in Northern Nigeria. Thank you. Please remember to subscribe and press your notification button so that you will receive notification when we release a new special report.
Climate change is real and action is desperately needed. Our new research is a rare window in understanding how exactly climate change affects conflict, at the case of Nigeria. Taking a step back, looking across the Sahel, we see that climate change has affected a broader region quite substantially, with increasing temperatures by about 1 degree Celsius and changing rainfall patterns. And this impact of climate change has affected livelihoods and has played a substantial role in violence, more specifically in farmer-herder violence that is observable across the Sahel. There are several reasons to focus this visual on Nigeria. First of all, Nigeria has been affected by climatic distress to a large extent. Secondly, farmer-herder violence is a common problem, especially in Nigeria's Middle Belt region has witnessed a high degree of resource competition and related violence. Climate change affected migratory patterns of pastoralists, which increases the likelihood of both farmers and herders to interact, which in turn increases the likelihood of disputes between the two groups, prompting the government to implement the National Livestock Transformation Plan, a plan that aims at modernizing the livestock sector by installing grazing reserves for pastoralist communities.
We think this plan represents Nigeria's most comprehensive strategy yet to encourage pastoralists to switch to ranching and other sedentary livestock production systems. But inadequate political leadership, funding constraints and uncertainties, and a lack of expertise could derail its implementation. If the plan fails, or if it's abandoned by the successive government, Nigeria could suffer more deadly violence, which would further threaten the country's political stability and her food security.
The impact of climate change on local communities can be profound, non-linear, and indirect, and using data can help you to study the issue more systematically. While the Nigeria visuals primarily focus on violence in recent years, we can use the same data and methods to make statements about the future, which potentially could contribute to an early warning methodology. These visuals are important to understand how climate change affects livelihood and conflict. And while the National Livestock Transformation Plan is an important policy acknowledging climate change, it falls short in understanding the mechanisms of climate security. And products like our visuals can help to spotlight on how climate change affects livelihoods and under which circumstances this leads to conflict.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Oge Onubogu, and I am the director of the West Africa program here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. We are humbled to welcome all our viewers to this important discussion on religion, identity, and conflict in northern Nigeria. We had over 400 RSVPs for this virtual conversation, so obviously this is a topic of great importance and urgency. For more than 3 decades, clashes between different ethno-religious communities across northern Nigeria have killed thousands, displaced countless people, and destroyed livelihoods. Whether we describe them as intercommunal conflicts or clashes between farmers and herders, or banditry and criminality, these conflicts have become increasingly violent in recent years, and their possible religious dimensions have also gotten a lot of attention. However, the drivers of these conflicts are complex and span multiple overlapping cleavages related to identity, which includes ethnicity and religion, and livelihood activities such as farming and pastoralism. Addressing the root causes of these conflicts requires a more nuanced understanding of these overlapping themes. USIP is delighted to co-host this conversation today with our colleagues from Mercy Corps, a leading global research and peacebuilding organization. The discussion today will look at Mercy Corps' new USAID-funded research, and we will examine the complex linkages between the political, economic, and identity-based conflicts that are driving violent conflict in northern Nigeria. We will also discuss the implications for policy and programmatic interventions. Today, we will also hear from practitioners and academics who are working in the field of religion and peacebuilding, as well as highlight some of USIP's research and data collection activities in these areas. I would like to remind the audience that you can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Northern Nigeria Conflict. I also encourage our viewers to send in your questions through the chat function. Before I turn over to the panel discussion today, I would like to call on my colleague, Mr. Muktari Shitu from USAID, to give some remarks. Muktari is currently the Conflict Program Manager at the USAID mission in Abuja, Nigeria. Prior to joining USAID in 2010, Muktari worked as a senior political specialist at the US Embassy in Abuja. In his current position at USAID, he provides oversight to the agency's conflict mitigation and CVE programs, including the Community Initiatives to Promote Peace Project, which covers 6 states across Nigeria. He has participated in designing and managing several peace-building projects across Nigeria, and also serves on different committees focused on addressing issues of violent extremism in Northeast Nigeria. On a personal note, Muktari's home community in northern Nigeria was also affected by 2 major violent conflict attacks in 2012 and 2015. Muktari has degrees from the Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, from Bayero University in Kano, and the School for International Training in Vermont. Muktari, I'd like to turn it over to you now in Abuja.
Thank you so much, Oge. And again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our distinguished ladies and gentlemen that have joined us across the world. I also would like to thank the USAID, especially Oge and Mercy Corps staff and others who have assiduously worked hard to make these findings of the research available to the public. So as Oge mentioned, my name is Muktari Shitu, and I work with the Peace and Democratic Governance Office under the United States Agency for International Development in Abuja, Nigeria. And I also provide an oversight function to the CIPP project, which conducted this research. So the question is, why this research? And this is the fundamental question that the research will try to answer. Thank you for your background, Oge, but looking at the recent intensity of violence in Nigeria is deeply concerning and sad, not only to all of us, ordinary Nigerian peace-building practitioners, religious leaders, human rights activists, researchers, and others. Every day we are inundated with news from Nigerians about how innocent people have been killed, communities displaced, buildings are razed down, and including places of worship, and also the means of livelihood that are being destroyed due to violent conflict. Now, this rising insecurity is polarizing communities along ethnic and religious identities and weakening the structures of democracy. And perhaps the most concerning is the fact that sometimes this violence takes ethnic and religious undertones. So some of the questions that came to our mind during the brainstorming exercise or sessions that we have with Mercy Corps and those who have undertaken this particular research is that are these conflicts religiously motivated? Or are they driven by economic or political or social factors, as earlier mentioned by Oge? Or are they motivated by the context or contestation over resources, such as land and water point, as manifested sometimes between farmers and pastoralists? Or are there some underlying drivers of this conflict that are directly or indirectly exacerbating the myriad of conflicts, or if I may say at the end, the combination of these factors responsible for this intensity in violence? So these are some of the questions that hopefully will provide these answers from the research. But as a learning organization, USAID supported Mercy Corps to conduct this research to better understand the causes or drivers of this conflict. Empirical data equips us with knowledge about trends, dynamics, and actors that are involved in the conflict to help us understand, but also to help us in designing new programs or make adjustment to the current ones. It also helps us to be accountable to the taxpayers, what we're doing, just to ensure that we're doing the right thing. Like one of the UICP's instructors said in one of the courses that I attended, without data, we are just guessing. And data helps us to watch the road before we cross it. So this research is about making sure we watch the road before we cross it. The research findings today may not be able to answer all the questions that we have, but certainly will provide us with the much needed trusted information. And it can open up to several other areas that other researchers can actually interrogate or find more data about it. So on behalf of USAID, I would like you for your participation, and I look forward to a robust and engaging conversation around this. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Mukhtari. So now I'm going to turn it over to our colleagues from Mercy Corps for the presentation. So I will call on Emmanuel Obudu, who is the Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Manager for the USAID-supported community initiatives to promote peace project at Mercy Corps in Nigeria. Over the last 10 years, Emmanuel has been providing leadership in setting up M&E systems and in improving program performance through monitoring, evaluation, and learning across several donor-funded projects at Mercy Corps and other international organizations. He is a certified project manager with degrees in psychology. Also joining Emmanuel for this presentation will be Dr. Ryan Sheely. Ryan is the Director of Research in Conflict and Governance at Mercy Corps. His research is focused on using mixed methods to design and evaluate programs focused on civic engagement and building effective, accountable states. His academic research has been published in several journals, including World Development, Comparative Political Studies, and Social Science Quarterly. Prior to joining Mercy Corps, Ryan spent 10 years on the faculty at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and he also holds a PhD in political science from Yale University. So Emmanuel and Ryan, I'll turn it over to you for the presentation.
Thanks so much. So what Emmanuel and I are going to present today are a set of the key findings and implications from a recent Mercy Corps report titled Fear of the Unknown, which Emmanuel co-authored with our colleague Adam Lichtenheld. As Oge and Mukhtari mentioned, this study was motivated by recent trends in intercommunal conflict in northern Nigeria, which have become increasingly violent. In recent years, commentators have increasingly highlighted the religious dimensions of intercommunal conflict, suggesting that this violence is motivated by hatred and discrimination across religious lines. Other commentators have de-emphasized the role of religion and instead characterized these conflicts as a consequence of increased banditry and growing resource competition. To help fill the evidence gaps at the heart of these debates, we posed 3 core research questions. First, what are the main drivers and motivations for violence in North Central and Northwest Nigeria? Second, what are the specific processes by which religious actors, identities, and institutions catalyze violent conflict? And third, what mechanisms have communities used to prevent violence and mitigate religious tensions? I'll now hand it over to Emmanuel to provide an overview of how we conducted this research and what we found.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I'll go ahead with how we undertake the research. To answer these research questions, we drew on multitude of quantitative and qualitative data sources, and to examine broad patterns and trends in violence, we analyzed different sources of violent event data in 12 states in North Central and also Northwest Nigeria over the past 10 years. We complemented this analysis of violent event data with 2 phases of field research, which are conducted in Kaduna and Kano states. And the first phase used 165 in-depth interviews with key informants and local community members in both states to capture qualitative insights and the conflict dynamics, the processes and pathways to violence. And also the second phase of the field research, we used a survey of 750 residents in 15 communities across the 2 states, that is Kano and Kaduna, and to quantitatively evaluate the factors that are associated with individual support for and the willingness to participate in violence. So what did we learn from the research? In this presentation, we want to highlight 4 key findings from our reports. First, only some violence has been inter-religious in nature, and Muslims and Christians, they are both being perpetrators and victims of this violence. And analysis of data from ACLED, the Council on Foreign Relations, and Nigeria Watch indicates that from 2010 to 2020, only 9% of attacks explicitly targeted or were carried out by religious groups. And only 10% of those fatalities were ascribed to conflicts over a religious issue. This finding from the violent event data set is supported by our survey data. The graph on this side, it shows that a majority of Muslims and Christians, the survey respondents, they say that members of both faiths are responsible for violence in their area, as opposed to pinning blame solely on one side. Okay, also, we would like to see the second aspect of it, which is rather than being driven by religious belief or hatred, violence that falls along religious line is typically a consequence of insecurity and a lack of social cohesion between ethno-religious groups. This slide shows the analysis of the survey data that shows that the more religious people are, the less likely they are to support or engage violence. And this holds across both Muslims and Christians' faith. Okay, also, instead, this slide shows how the next slide, which is talking about the key findings, the drivers of the violence. Instead, this slide shows how insecurity and weakened social cohesion, they combine to lead to violence. An increase in perceived insecurity correspond with a 25 to 35% increase in respondents' support for the use of violence and their willingness to engage in it. Meanwhile, a decrease in social cohesion, including intergroup trust, is associated with a 43 to 60% increase in respondents' willingness to endorse violence. The dynamic was echoed in our qualitative interview, including one of our leader that we interviewed, who described this pattern saying, "I call it fear of the unknown, because people know they can be attacked if there is a crisis." Next slide. Okay, the third point here that I would like us to know is that while we did not find that religious belief or hatred is a root cause of violence, we did find evidence that religious identities that provide opportunities and motivation for both elites and ordinary individuals to mobilize violence. This slide illustrates both of this pathway of mobilization through examples from our qualitative interview. If you look at the first quote there, it talks about where they say most people in Kano are religious. The first quote shows how political and religious leaders, they intentionally politicize or they enhance or they decide to enhance the salience of religious identity to spur people to action, particularly around elections, which create windows of vulnerability by raising the potential for shifts in power between groups. So the second quote also, if we look at it, it shows how members of the public make solidarity claims to co-ethnic or co-religionists to garner support in a quarrel, which can allow interpersonal dispute to escalate into conflicts between identity groups. Okay, the fourth point, which is the last, although we find that religious leaders, they can amplify conflicts, they can also be custodians of peace. This slide, it shows that survey respondents who say that religious leaders help to resolve disputes in their area, they are significantly less likely to support violence. This finding holds no matter how often people say that religious leaders are actually successful in resolving disputes. I will now hand over to my colleague Ryan to wrap it up here. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. So to sum up, the big picture takeaway from our report is that recent intercommunal violence in northern Nigeria is not simply a consequence of religious discrimination or persecution. Rather, our analysis indicates that the violence that we're observing is a result of a confluence of factors, including governance gaps, particularly in security provision, a lack of social cohesion and trust between groups, and the mobilization of religious identities by both elites and ordinary individuals. I'll close by highlighting two recommendations. First, we recommend a shift in how we think and talk about conflict across religious divides, away from a picture of a clash of civilizations that is an unchanging root cause of violence, towards an appreciation of the role that religion can play as a potential catalyst and mobilizer that interacts with the actual root causes of conflict in a given context and is deployed strategically by both mass and elite actors. Second, this shift in mindset and framing leads us to recommend a specific set of programming interventions to address intercommunal conflict in northern Nigeria. This includes interventions that focus on preventing the escalation of disputes into violence by training religious leaders in negotiation and dispute resolution, and paying specific attention to misinformation and disinformation within windows of risk, such as elections. This also includes interventions that address root causes by strengthening intergroup interactions and trust, particularly around natural resource management, and interventions that address governance shortcomings by increasing the effectiveness, inclusiveness, and accountability of security and service provision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan and Emmanuel. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack over there, and I know that there will be, we will get a lot of questions during the Q&A. But now I want to move this from the research to the practitioner side. And I want to call on Kaltumi Abdulaziz. Kaltumi is the program officer at the Interfaith Mediation Center, IMC, based in Kaduna, Nigeria. Over at the IMC, Kaltumi oversees peace-building programs in 6 states across northern Nigeria and the Middle Belt. Kaltumi is often described as a youth leader, a gender activist, and a peace advocate. She has served as a resource person on these issues within Nigeria and across Africa, including in Ethiopia, Senegal, Egypt, and Mauritius. Kaltumi is also a member of USIP's Nigerian Network of Facilitators, NNF, which is a group of professional peace mediators trained by USIP to resolve local conflicts in their communities through nonviolent means. Kaltumi also participated in a recent USIP data collection exercise to help understand the drivers of conflict in the Middle Belt and Northwest Nigeria. She has degrees from the University of Abuja in Nigeria. So Kaltumi, as a practitioner who works on these complex issues across northern Nigeria, how has evidence helped to inform your work?
Thank you very much, Oye, for the introduction. The insecurity in Nigeria, you know, a lot of people believe has a multifarious and a multidimensional relationship with, you know, interreligious and ethno relationship to, you know, historical trajectories, bureaucratic terrorism, and political quagmire. However, permit me to share a practical experience my team and I conducted in Zamfara State. Activity and conflict transformation. You know, oftentimes a lot of civil society organizations, you know, make assumptions of certain issues and also certain issues. However, there is need for critical analysis. You know, when we are talking about the context of the conflict happening in most of the states in Nigeria. However, I'm going to be using Zamfara State as a case study, as I earlier said. During this research, we made some observations through our correspondents, and the fact is that these people are as confused as we are. They are asking the same questions we are asking. They ask us questions like, you know, we are poor people, we are farmers, so we do not know why these marauders keep attacking us and killing us. We live peacefully with there's peaceful coexistence between the Muslims and the Christians. As a matter of fact, the Christians own majority of the medical store which we purchase our medications from. So we do not believe that this, this violence has any association with religion or culture. However, we strongly believe that this has a political undertone or a divide and rule tactics in such a way that at the moment where we are running away to seek places of perceived calm, there are people out there stealing our resources. They were precise to say our gold. And there are sex traffickers who are taking away our girls. At that moment, the first thing that came to mind was this: who would have thought about some of these issues coming up apart from the physical aspect of the violent conflict. However, it is also very important that there is need for a power shift, because it seems it is obvious that the relationship between community members and their leadership is huge. The gap is extremely huge, and this has also affected the security architecture in most of these communities. Permit me to also talk about the essence of humanitarian responses and also psychosocial support for most of the victims of this conflict. A lot of these people are left to heal on their own. There's no any form of humanitarian responses so far from the data we collected, and also there is no psychosocial support, to assist most of the victims suffering who are traumagenic. And I mean, it is a daydream for you as a peace practitioner to talk about or to preach peace to these people when they are suffering in pain, because these are people that have lost their loved ones, their means of livelihood, practically everything that they own. This is impossible. So it is very important that we begin to look into that aspect. Also, I would like to talk about supporting local ideas and content. I would like to suggest that as much as I am aware that most of us as peace practitioners want to support, these community people, it's also important that we give them an opportunity to own the process. Community, local ideas, they should be part of the planning and the implementation of most of these ideas. There is an African adage that says that he who plays the piper dictates the tune, meaning that majority of these victims are the ones suffering from the pain, from most of the violence happening to them. But at the end of the day, they're not involved in the planning and implementation. If we begin to involve them in the entire process, we're not only building their capacity, we are giving them a leadership role to be able to manage and mitigate conflicts, facilitate community dialogue, and also mediation processes. I would like to also say that the role of women in peace building and in post-conflict construction can never be overemphasized. Of course, this is also in resonance to the values expressed by the UNSCR 1325. And most of these women have critical roles to play at the community level, at their own level, serving the position of mothers, wives, daughters, to majority of the perpetrators of this conflict. However, they are not involved in the processes. It is high time we begin to involve these local women, to participate fully in peace building processes and even including post-conflict construction. If possible, I would like to reemphasize that there's need for us to build on already existing structures that these people have at the community level, structures such as early warning, early response mechanisms, and also alternative dispute resolutions. If we can build their capacity to be able to handle and own most of the processes, most of these peace building processes, I have there are signs and hopes that most of the interventions will be more authentic and more sustainable. I would like to conclude to say that the current violence or insecurity in Nigeria is unpredictably predictable. However, one thing is for sure: the people are seeking for justice, and there's a general saying that the costliest peace is cheaper than the cheapest war. So I think it's high time we go back to the drawing board to re-strategize, do the needful in analyzing the context of this conflict, and also providing local context and solutions to them. Thank you very much, Oge.
Thank you so much, Kaltumi. I think really highlighting the importance of understanding local context and inclusion. So I'd like us to move slightly out of the Nigerian context now and explore the general theme of religion and conflict, or religion and peace building. And I want to call on my colleague from USIP, Dr. Jason Klochek, who is a senior researcher with USIP's Religion and Inclusive Societies program. He is also an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham School of Politics and International Relations and a faculty affiliate of the University of Notre Dame Center for the Study of Religion and Society. His research and teaching investigates political violence and repression with particular attention to the relationship between religion and conflict. His work has been published in several journals, in several journals, including the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, and on many media outlets, including the Washington Post and NBC News Think. Dr. Klochek has degrees from the University of California in Berkeley and Georgetown University. So Jason, as we've heard from the presentation today, religion plays a complex role in conflicts, serving as both an inspiration for violence and as a powerful force for peace. Given your work on religion and peace building, what can we learn from other settings that could be relevant to understanding the complexity of conflict in northern Nigeria? Jason?
Thank you so much. Okay, it's a privilege to be part of the panel and tackle some of these challenging questions you've just posed. I'll start by saying I especially appreciate the opportunity to learn from and reflect on the really exceptional research conducted by Mercy Corps in partnership with USAID, as well as from peace practitioners in Nigeria. As you mentioned, my expertise lies at the intersection of religion and conflict, broadly speaking, rather than Nigeria specifically. So I thought I'd frame these concluding remarks in a way of setting the discussion in comparative perspective by posing a few questions. In particular, I want to draw attention to 4 sets of questions on religion and conflict that I find the Mercy Corps research inviting us to engage with and reflect on more deeply. The first is straightforward. What does it mean to say religion is part of a conflict? In some ways, the most intriguing part of the study to me is what the researchers didn't find. That is, they don't find a strong relationship between religious belief and support for violence. And as several panelists have mentioned, that stands in stark contrast to what we often hear in the popular media, which quickly frames violence in northern Nigeria and other conflict settings as interreligious. Not just Muslims versus Christians in northern Nigeria, but Hindus versus Buddhists in Sri Lanka, Shiites versus Sunnis in Iraq, Protestants versus Roman Catholics in Northern Ireland. Subsumed in those narratives, though, are assumptions that differences in religious beliefs or identities drive violence. As a helpful counterpoint, the Mercy Corps research highlights far more earthly concerns, namely insecurity and the lack of trust driven by competition over resources. But the research does more. It also helps us move away from that rather unhelpful question of whether or not people are fighting over religion, and instead look at ways religion might shape conflict, even when not the cause. In the case of northern Nigeria, the Mercy Corps research highlights how religion is providing opportunities for political and religious leaders to mobilize support in pursuit of other goals, political, economic, or personal. And we've seen that in many other contexts. During the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, the troubles in Northern Ireland, or more recently in Indonesia and India. Sadly, there are too many cases for us to draw lessons from. And this pattern raises a second question, namely, why does religion prove to be such a powerful mobilizing force? The main reason highlighted in our discussion today is the way it overlaps with socioeconomic and political disparities. And again, this is of course not unique to Nigeria. Similar patterns can be seen in the Philippines, for example, where poverty rates are double in the Muslim majority South than what they are in the northern region, mostly populated by Christians. Political, economic, and social inequalities also define different religious communities from Iraq to Sri Lanka to elsewhere. But I'll ask, is it just this overlap between religious identities and inequality that makes religion such a powerful organizational tool? Is there also something about the emotive pull of religion, charismatic authority of religious leaders, and attention to other worldly goals that helps mobilize collective action? A third set of questions is inspired by the report's warning that continued religious mobilization could lead religion to play a more central role in the conflict. What would be the consequences of that? Will it lead to more lethal attacks? Or, as Mukhtar mentioned, will there be more attacks on places of worship or against religious leaders, which we've seen a rise in since 2015? And will the violence become more intractable once religion becomes more central rather than remaining on the periphery? Unfortunately, scholarship on religious conflict provides little reasons to be optimistic, especially on the last question. Cross-national studies and case studies document that conflicts in which religion plays a central role, even when not the cause, tend to both last longer and be more resistant to negotiated settlement than other types of conflict. A fourth and final set of questions worth considering relate to policy responses, and here I'll be purposefully provocative. Most importantly, we need to ask, how can we as external actors acknowledge and respond to religious dimensions of conflict without reinforcing and reifying those divisions? A key recommendation of the report, as Ryan mentioned, is to identify and elevate religious peacemakers. But could such engagement not also make religion more salient? And how do we do that without instrumentalizing religious leaders ourselves? Moreover, and to Kaltumi's point, how do we enlist select religious leaders without exacerbating other inequalities, including gender inequalities that cut across and within religious communities? Here I find the additional recommendation to conduct religious landscape mapping in Nigeria particularly welcome. Recent work by USIP's Religion and Inclusive Societies program points to several productive examples of how to do this, including our most recent religious landscape mapping on Iraq. That said, the task is always far easier in theory than in practice. So we need to consider both the benefits and unintended costs of religious engagement. I'll conclude by apologizing for providing more questions than answers, but then again, my remarks are inspired by what I see as the central strength of the Mercy Corps research. That is that's a call to approach conflict in northern Nigeria and elsewhere with a more nuanced understanding of the religious dimensions and robust local knowledge. Asking the wrong questions, such as does religion cause conflict or not, will not only keep those productive steps moving forward hidden from us, but it could also lead us to do more harm than good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jason, for those remarks. We already have tons of questions coming in, so we're going to add your questions to that list too as well as part of the conversation. So as we sieve through the questions, I'm going to take some privilege as the moderator here and pose a question to Ryan and Emmanuel. So from your presentation and from the report, as we've discussed today, you recommend against thinking of religious animosity as a root cause of violence in northern Nigeria. Can you say some more about the evidence in your research that led you to this conclusion?
Okay, thank you very much, Oge. Thanks for this question. We came to this way of thinking about religion as a catalyst or mobilizer rather than a root cause of conflict, based on a number of strong patterns in both our qualitative and quantitative data that we collected from the field. In the overall 165 in-depth interview that we conducted, the men and women that were interviewed, they clearly and were consistently saying that conflicts can become religious, but in most cases, they are fundamentally about other issues. And as a business woman in Kaduna State, she put in her interview that any little spark, people will attach it to religion. And also a youth in Kano State also echoed this idea, saying that some people just wrap a dispute around religion so they can gain more support. And if you approach the issue with an open mind, most of the time you will just see that what causes the problem has nothing to do with religion at all. And overall, the central theme in our qualitative interview was that religion is characterized as a secondary factor, which has other things that are interwoven with it, which include land and resource competition, insecurity, political competition, and also economic hardship, like my co-panelists have talked about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Ryan, do you want to add some points to that?
Sure, thanks. So I'll just build on those examples by highlighting a particularly compelling quantitative finding from a small randomized experiment that we conducted within our survey. So in this survey experiment, respondents were randomly assigned to be read one of two nearly identical versions of a scenario featuring an interpersonal dispute with a shopkeeper, and then were asked about their level of support for different kinds of punishment or retaliation, including nonviolent boycotts, recourse to government authorities, or using violence. So half of the respondents were randomly assigned to receive a generic version of the scenario, or the control version. The other half received a treatment version, which was identical except that the shopkeeper was identified as a member of the respondent's religious outgroup. So a local Muslim shopkeeper if the respondent was Christian, or a local Christian shopkeeper if the respondent was Muslim. The core hypothesis behind this experiment is that if violence is driven by interreligious animosity or discrimination, then respondents who received the treatment scenario that primed religious identity should be expected to favor more severe and more violent forms of retaliation. However, what we find is that respondents are no more likely to support a harsher punishment for the shopkeeper when he is explicitly identified as a member of their religious outgroup than when his group identity is not mentioned at all. This finding is consistent across Muslim and Christian respondents. This is not meant to imply, as Emmanuel said, that religious discrimination does not exist in the region. We certainly did detect some in our interviews. And we don't mean to say that it never contributes to violence. But the evidence suggests that, in general, discriminatory attitudes and behaviors are insufficient explanations for intercommunal conflict in the region, including conflict that falls along religious lines.
Thank you very much, Ryan. So I will go through some of these questions, and I also want to remind our audience that you can join this conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Northern Nigeria Conflict. And I do want to apologize in advance in case we do not get to your question on here, because there are a lot of questions on here. So I want to pose the next question to Kaltumi. Kaltumi, Emmanuel, and Ryan. Kaltumi, you spoke about the data collection exercise that you carried out in Zamfara State. And that data collection exercise, by the way, was supported through the State Department Bureau for Conflict Stabilization Operations. You spoke about the importance of engaging community leaders and including members of the community in the design process. Given that community leaders, CSO actors, and local government officials can be effective agents in resolving conflicts, did you find, and I guess this will go to all three of you, in your interactions with different respondents, did you find differential patterns in the interactions of these, of elites, with elites?
Thank you very much for the question again. Yes, as peace practitioner, a lot of us have the, the professional experience, of conflict analysis, peace building skills, and etc. But then, when you go to the community level, they do not have some of these experiences that we have. However, at their level, they're already doing one or two things to solve their own issue, but oftentimes not resolved. So the question now bounces back to us as practitioners is, how can we develop models that local community members can use at their level to solve their own issues? Take, for instance, we have traditional leaders
I think we've lost the connection with Kaltumi.
Traditional leaders. Sorry?
No, go ahead. You went off screen for a second. It's technology, new era.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so however, we often experience and capacity in conflict analysis, the dynamics and the frameworks that are needed, to facilitate most of the dialogue processes that occur. So how this has resulted to a lot of issues unresolved, and community members at their own level sometimes are unable to add their input because of the imbalance. I talked about the power imbalance between leaders and of course community members. So if we can facilitate events where there can be of a power width relationship, where community members their suggestions, their recommendations matters, I think it will go a long way in providing more sustainable ideas to solve some of this violent conflict that keeps reoccurring at the community level.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kaltumi. And Emmanuel, as you want to add on to that, I will just pose an additional question to hook onto that too as well, since it's somewhat related. So do you think politics is influencing religious violence more than the interpretation of religious doctrines that supports violence in the northern part of Nigeria?
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to add to what Kaltume has just said. We practitioners, we already have something in mind. Like most of the time when we are designing our programs, we go to the fields to do just need assessments, to talk to the people, then we come out and we design. So it would be nice if we have something like the human-centered design, where we can involve everybody in the community, where their voices are very important. It will not be like the top-bottom approach, but the bottom-top approach where we carry everyone along. To add to the question you just asked, from our interview with respondents in the field, we discovered that actually, this is not religiously inclined, but somehow like politically inclined, because many people, like politicians, are looking for support. So they come up with this religious idea and try to, like Kaltume said earlier, divide and rule, to make people to say, okay, we just make sure that we move towards this side of the people that belong to our religion, and the other side, the people that goes to that one too. So I would like to say that from our findings, this is not, the conflict is not religiously inclined, but some persons are using it to gather support for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So let me pull up another question here. And so according to Ashutosh Varshney, has found different patterns of elite relations in high and local conflict locations in places like Indonesia and India. Jason, I will pose this to both you and Ryan. Given USIP's work, and also with Mercy Corps in your work in religion and peace building, did you find anything similar in this research in northern Nigeria? You can speak about it from the perspective of the research in northern Nigeria, and Jason, more generally from your work on religion and peace building. Whoever wants to start with that.
Ryan, do you want to talk about northern Nigeria first, and then I'll jump in on broader sort of perspective?
Let's go the opposite direction. You can start with the broad aperture, and then I'll pull in any other.
Okay, great. Yeah, so those I think are examples I also had in mind as I was reading the report, that is Indonesia and India. I also kept thinking of Sudan in the 1970s. This ties to the previous question of, once religion is used to mobilize and becomes a part of more routine politics, it often becomes entrenched or spirals into a pattern in which additional elites have to take increasingly more extreme or radical claims. So you get this spiral of what becomes religious outbidding. And I think that's a danger that we're seeing in Nigeria. Now, this question is very interesting in that perhaps elites at the national level and at the local level may have different preferences and may be appealing to different communities. And so I'd love to hear from Ryan if that's happening in Nigeria. or not. But it's something at least observed in the cases mentioned at the national level. I don't think we have a lot of data at the subnational level to see how this process plays out. So let me pause there and see if.
Yeah, I'll offer a few comments and then we can continue and dig into other examples. We found two types of tactics that leaders and local elites were using to really use religion as a mobilizer. And the first is salience tactics. So really amplifying religious identities relative to other identities, particularly as we've noticed in moments around elections. And there were reports of this language and rhetoric amping up in advance of elections. And then the second is boundary tactics, or in which there is really identifying religious divides and really redefining membership along sectarian, economic, and ethnic lines. So thinking about who is in an in or out group in a local area. And again, this intersected with both moments of religious conflict as well as shocks and scarcity around resources. So I'll pause there because I think that even that deeper analysis of some of those mechanisms and kind of roles of specific elites is, I think, an important area of future inquiry and research, and it kind of starting again from deeper qualitative work and building that. But those are a few of the patterns and mechanisms that were identified in our study.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And maybe a follow on to that, as I see one question here, where it's, given the challenges and limitations of reliable data on conflict causes, nature of attacks and impacts, is there a risk that government justice, that is arrest sentences, may engender more feelings of injustice? Any one of you want to tackle that question?
So okay, again, I can say something sort of maybe at the comparative level, and then if our other panelists want to mention how this might play out, particularly in Nigeria. Certainly when it comes to religious discrimination and repression, or religious violence and repression, we observe a cyclical relationship. That is, oftentimes repression leads to grievances, as you're mentioning, which could then fuel additional conflict. But at the same time, some research I've done with a colleague, Peter Henne, we've also shown that that discrimination, the violence can also lead to more discrimination. So you get this pattern in which people rebel because they feel repressed or their justice isn't being administered, but then the government overcorrects and tries to repress or monitor or regulate religious communities, which then fuels more grievances. And so I'm curious in Nigeria how that might play out, both the repression and also the application of justice if it isn't seen as equal.
Okay, I would like to take it up from here. From our findings, like one of the respondents in Kajuru, he said that part of what the government is doing, they are not actually responding to perpetrators of some violent conflicts, especially maybe if it relates to farmers and herders. So even when those issues are being reported, you discover that nothing is being done about it. And because of that, there are a lot of grievances and there is tension along the line, especially when it's involved a Christian farmer and a Muslim pastoralist. So you discover that when one is not held responsible, especially if he's a farmer or he is a pastoralist, the other side will feel grieved, and also we want to take the laws into their hands and feel that since the government is not doing anything, I will have to do something on my own. So when there are no responses like that, there are a lot of tension across the religious line.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Kaltumi.
Okay, just to add to what Emmanuel talked about, during our interview session with some of our respondents also in Zamfara State, they made mention of issues that has to relate with empathy. They complained that each time they are attacked in their community, there is no government representative, nobody to come sympathize with them. They are allowed to heal on their own, in spite losing their loved ones, their livelihoods, and practically everything that they've lived for. The government does nothing. The least that they do is to send some military men to their communities, and they leave in few days, maximum 3 days, they said. So what is the proof that government really care about us? Another respondent made mention to say that at some point, we decided to defend ourselves. Each time these marauders come into our community, we fight back. And at the end of the whole scenario, the government come back to arrest us. Arrest us for what? For fighting back. So there's this confusion. And also, a woman categorically said that because she was one of the women that was kidnapped and released afterwards, she said that these gunmen said to them, "Stop worrying, the government know about us, there's nothing you can do." Until date, she says she's trying to fathom and understand these words because it really did hit her. If they cannot depend on government security, that means there's no safe space for anybody. And of course, anyone can be a victim. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kaltumi. And I think along those lines, just to pull on one of the questions that I see here, how can emotional resilience, as in one's ability to adapt to stressful situations or crisis, so how can emotional resilience help in building peace, reconciliation? Or can it help in building peace, reconciliation?
I'll come in briefly on this. I think it's tremendously important. The title of our report is Fear of the Unknown, and the theme of our research that came through both in the surveys and in the interviews is this real fear and uncertainty, which does come from an emotional and psychological place. And so having that sense of psychological safety, and as Kaltumi mentioned, really focusing on psychosocial well-being is a first step to then starting to rebuild trust and relationships within groups, right? And so trying to, just bring groups together for dialogue and trust building without addressing that real psychological toll has a risk. So these, in some of our own programming in Nigeria and in elsewhere, go hand in hand. And I'll hand it over to other colleagues to speak about other specific practical examples, but just to highlight a few thoughts there.
Thank you so much. Jason, did you want to come in here?
Okay, I'll just add that for those who are joining us, they might also look at the USIP project page on religion and psychosocial support. So the Institute is currently working on a pilot project on Colombia and Venezuela on psychosocial support for displaced trauma survivors. And so, Kaltumi, I think it goes to a lot of what you're asking. So that project will hopefully expand to other places. But here at the USIP, we are thinking about these questions, and we'll look forward to partnering with other organizations like Mercy Corps moving forward too. But for those listening, you can check out the religion and psychosocial support page as well.
Thank you so much, Jason. And so if I could draw on that question a little bit to pick up one of the questions here, how can we ensure that international humanitarian interventions are better designed to ensure conflict sensitivity and integration of humanitarian peace and security approach in Nigeria? And this is a question that is open to anyone who wants to jump in here.
Okay, like I said earlier, we would like to look at designing the program from the grassroots level, like I talked about the human-centered design, and about the human-centered design where you carry the community stakeholders along, and they can tell you what will work for them and what will not work. like there are some structures that are already in the community, like the early warning, early response structures, and just for us to build on those things. And like part of what we do in CIPP at Mercy Corps, we make sure that we build the capacity of the local leaders, where they will be able to address local conflicts before those disputes become violent conflict. So we build their capacity also by also strengthening the local structures that is in the community. Not only that, by making sure that the early warning, early response system that the community have been using for a very long time, the capacity is being strengthened, and we make sure to see how it will function very well. So if we look at how we can design the program from the grassroots level, that is from the bottom-up approach instead of the top-bottom approach, instead of us having an idea that this is what we feel that when we take to the community is going to work, but rather we meet with the community. This is what we are thinking, and they tell us that, no, this might not work. This is how we'll go about it. And with that approach, I believe that we'll be able to tackle a lot of these issues in northern Nigeria. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Kaltumi, I see you went on mute. Did you want to add anything here?
Yes, I just wanted to add the commitment under the core humanitarian standard that promotes, respect and fundamental human rights of community members in places affected by crisis. I think it's very important for us as peace builders to integrate into our system and our planning, feedback mechanism, from community members themselves in such a way that, they give us their suggestions, their complaints, and they feel safe and confident and transparent while doing that. I think that will help, improve our programming, strengthen relationships, trust between community members and field workers, and that will go a long way in making we as peace practitioners do more of the listening, while the community members who are, victims of most of these violent conflicts, do the talking. It's high time we give that space, we back up a little bit in our leadership position, let them lead the process by giving us most of these suggestions, for a more sustainable intervention.
Thank you very much, Kaltumi. Ryan, did you want to add a few points on here as well?
Sure. Yeah, just to build on this, I think it's also worth emphasizing that as we look at these types of bottom-up approaches that emphasize really genuine participation, to also create spaces for design and learning for specific groups of the community. So within the CIPP program, Emmanuel and I are actually starting to also do work on youth-led action research to center youth voices and perspectives in also identifying drivers of conflict in their communities, as well as designing solutions. And Mercy Corps does this work also in other contexts with women's groups and women-led CSO organizations. So really, in addition to thinking from the bottom up, recognizing diversity and inclusion within those that aim to really make sure there's a broad set of voices as local perspectives are elevated.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And USIP's work in Nigeria definitely employs that bottom-up, top-down approach in the way we engage with both government and civil society actors and community leaders. So there's definitely a lot of overlap here in areas for more conversation, because this conversation on religion identity in northern Nigeria, this is just the beginning. This is an ongoing conversation here. So now as we look at the international side, we want to come down to the national level as I look at a question here. And it says, is the role of the Nigerian national government more a positive or a negative, or maybe in between, more of a positive, negative, or an in-between one when it comes to the process of ethnic and religious reconciliation? And who wants to tackle this one? We call on Kaltumi or Emmanuel, if you talk more about the role of the government when it comes to the process of ethnic and religious reconciliation. What role the government is currently playing and what role they could play. And what are the entry points and opportunities that exist for them to play these roles?
Okay, like, let me say the government is actually trying, but we are hoping that they can put in their best. Like I'll start from Kaduna State. Like we have the Kaduna State Peace Agency, which CIPP is collaborating with. They are working on bringing on religious leaders, not only that, religious leaders, also community leaders, where we are having some of these conflicts onto the same table where they can reconcile them together. Also in Plateau State too, they have the Plateau State Peace Agency and also the interreligious conflict, interreligious commission, where they call them the NIREC, where also issues of religion and also conflict will be addressed. And so they have started the process, and I think is a snowball approach. We are hoping and believing that as the government, they are also collaborating with peace agencies and peace actors. Something good will come out of it because they alone cannot do it. We all have to put hands together to see how we can make this thing to work. So I think that is what I will have to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Oh, sorry, Kaltumi, I saw you went on mute, so I was wondering if you wanted to add anything. But I think it's wonderful that you mentioned the state peace-building agencies, as USIP also works with those agencies in Kaduna, in Plateau, and in Adamawa State. And going back to that notion of a bottom-up, top-down approach, this is a process. This is an ongoing process. And I think getting to a point where there is that commitment, and then starting from the point of commitment and moving forward. I think the understanding that peace is a process is one that should be driven home here. And then let me go up to a question, knowing that we do not have any climate change specialist on the panel today, but perhaps from your research, a question here is: what is the impact of climate change on pastoral family relations in northern Nigeria? Did any of this come up in your research? And Kaltumi as well, in your conversations and data collection in Zamfara, was there any mention of climate change? So Emmanuel, Ryan, or Kaltumi, whoever wants to start.
Okay.
Well, okay, just go ahead, Emmanuel.
Ladies first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so basically nothing specifically came out, talking about climate change. However, community members are unable to go to their farm as usual, for cultivation and for harvest because of the insecurity that is of course bedeviling the community, and of course this has led to high prices of food, services, to mention but few. Directly or indirectly, I think having affected people be unable to actually go to the farm to do the normal activities, their daily activities, and of course their means of survival. I think it has it in one way or the other has relationship and of course burning, because they also one of the women made mention about how their farmlands are being destroyed by either burning. Sometimes people just come and burn their crops in the farm. So this have one way or the other also reduced production when you talk about farming system.
Thank you, Kaltumi.
Okay, I would like to add to that. While conducting the interview in the field, some of the respondents, they talked about the climate change, most especially that is affecting the relationship between the farmers and the herders. One of the farmer in Kajuru was talking about due to late rainfall and the migration of the pastoralists, you see that some of them, they are moving from where they used to stay and they'll be moving to another part. And while they are moving, they just encroach into their crops and destroy it. That sometimes before, the normal practice is that after their harvest, they invite the pastoralists, the herders, to come and graze on the remnants on the soil, the farm, so that they can use the waste products from their cattle as a manure for them. But this time around, because of the climate change, it's not like that again. So they tend to move earlier than the time that they used to move, maybe during the harvest period where they can come in. So it has actually affected the relationship and also causing some tension between them.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack there on the question of climate change. So hopefully another event on this down the road on this. So we have just a few more minutes left. And I want to go around to all our panelists and give each person less than 1 minute to give any closing remarks. Less than a minute to give any closing remarks or any thoughts that you want to leave us with. And I will go ahead and start with Jason. And I see. There you go.
Great. Thanks. Yep. Okay. Thanks. Okay. Well, I'll first start by saying that, again, what a privilege it is to join this panel and to have learned even more than reading the report, but by listening to these examples and experiences from Northern Nigeria. To me, one of the central takeaways will have to be the question still of how do we talk about the religious dimensions of conflict without seeing religion as the cause or without reifying those divisions, without exacerbating those divisions. There still seems to be a tension in our conversation about wanting to talk about those religious dimensions or not, or talk about the religious dimensions of peace building, but not the religious dimensions of conflict. And so I think the challenge for us is, or at least one challenge for us moving forward, is to think about or accept that religion is this pervasive force, this influencing both violence and peace, and that a big question moving forward is considering under what conditions does it lead to violence or peace, and which actors can we collaborate with to build peace in Northern Nigeria and other places. And we can look to other examples from around the world, both for what's worked well, but also practices to avoid.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason. So I want to call on Ryan and Emmanuel if there's any, takeaway final thoughts you want to leave for us, a minute or less, because I'm being told that we have less than 4 minutes.
Okay, I would like to leave us with this. The people we spoke to, they tended to express greater concern over criminality and banditry than over ethno-religious conflicts. And they were more likely to emphasize cleavages other than religion, such as ethnicity and the farmer-herder conflict when discussing intercommunal violence. So thank you.